It's Friday and you may or may not be partying, but we can tell you who is. American oil companies, they're rolling in money, all thanks to the war in Ukraine. In fact, every time the American war machine feeds a conflict, its oil companies become richer. Tonight, we'll bring you the numbers and the pattern. Also, a story of how chickens come home to roost. Pakistan is complaining of cross-border terrorism. I'm serious. And Pakistan is warning the Taliban, stop terrorism or we will conduct surgical strikes. Irony is dead and buried. And the self-appointed champion of human rights, America, has declared war on its women. It's denying basic human rights to half of its population. We'll tell you about it. Also, an artificial sun that is making headlines. All these stories and more coming up. The headlines first. Tensions continue to escalate over the Korean Peninsula. South Korea and the US conducted joint air exercise with US B-52 bombers and fighter jets from both countries. It comes days after North Korea test-fired a new intercontinental ballistic missile. Indian Prime Minister Modi speaks to his British counterpart Rishi Sunak. He sought strong action against anti-India elements in the UK and raised the issue of economic offenders being given refuge by London. Iraq's powerful cleric Muqtada al-Sadr says he's quote-unquote freezing his movement for a year. The Shiite leader blamed the sinful practices of his supporters for his decision. Sadr has millions of supporters and he claims to be the Prophet's descendant. Europe is divided over China. The Hungarian Prime Minister backs the French President. Macron said Europe must not become a vassal of the US. Now Prime Minister Viktor Orban of Hungary says Europe must see if its foreign policy interests coincide with America. Eva Kaili, member of the European Parliament, is released from prison. She's a Greek lawmaker accused of corruption and is now under house arrest. She's accused in the Qatargate corruption scandal involving the European Parliament. And the European privacy watchdog creates a ChatGPT task force. It could be the first step towards a common policy on privacy rules on artificial intelligence. The war in Ukraine has been on for 415 days. Who's winning it? Not Russia. Certainly not Ukraine. It's the US oil companies. They're the ones winning this war. And tonight we'll show you how. As thousands die on the battlefield, American oil companies are raking in billions. How many, you ask? Try 200 billion. And this is just in profits. US oil companies have reaped $200 billion in pure profits. The war in Ukraine shook up the energy market because the West, led by the US, sanctioned Russian oil supplies, Russian energy supplies. They restricted Russian oil and gas supplies. And US companies were the clear beneficiaries of this. We're talking about data from November 2022. That was more than 4 months ago. The earnings are still on. They're still milking this war and sharing the spoils. Oil companies are cutting big checks to their executives. Case in point, ExxonMobil. It's one of the world's biggest energy companies. Its chief executive is a man called Darren Woods. He's just got a pay raise. A dream increment, if you ask me. Woods got a salary hike of 52%. So now his salary will be almost $36 million. That's close to 300 crore rupees, the salary of a CEO. Plus, there's a bonus and stock rewards. And there's a hike there too. An 80% hike, 80%. So his bonus and stock rewards will go up by 80%. And it's not like ExxonMobil is hiding any of this. The company says the bumper pay for Woods was quote-unquote reflective of record earnings and stock price performance. In other words, they're making big money. So let's pull up those numbers. Let's look at how ExxonMobil has been doing. In 2022, the company made $56 billion in profits. That's $6.3 million every hour in profits. I'll repeat that, $6.3 million every hour in profits. The shares of the company have outperformed its peers, and that too by a wide margin. They climbed by 160% last year. This is so brazen that even the US president had to speak out. Joe Biden said ExxonMobil is making more money than God. He said the profiteering by oil companies was outrageous.
Oil companies Record profits today are not because they're doing something new or innovative. Their profits are a windfall of war, the windfall from the brutal conflict that's ravaging Ukraine and hurting tens of millions of people around the globe.
But ExxonMobil is not the only company. Other major oil producers are also minting money, like Chevron. That's another major US oil producer, also the main rival of Exxon. Chevron made a record $36.5 billion. Their European peers are making big profits too, like Shell. Shell announced its biggest profits in history. This company, Shell, has been around for 115 years. And last year, they made their biggest profits ever. Profits worth $39.9 billion. British giant BP was not too far behind. It has reported $27.7 billion in profit. And these are all big numbers. They confirm what the world has known for a while. Oil companies capitalize on instability, and they are profiting from pain. American oil companies are masters of this art. Time and again, as the American war machine enters conflicts, American oil companies take home big checks. You may remember the war in Iraq. The US went to war in Iraq by selling a lie. They said Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and that they pose a threat to the world. So America invaded Iraq ostensibly to save the world and bring democracy. As it happened, they only helped themselves. Iraq was devastated. Saddam Hussein was killed. The Americans did not find any weapons of mass destruction, but they did find lots of oil. After the invasion, a slew of American oil companies rushed to Iraq, from ExxonMobil to Chevron and Halliburton. They all got a share of the loot. They all got access to Iraq's oil. And in the years since, American officials have admitted this. They've confirmed that the war was only about Iraq's oil. I have some statements. The first one is from General John Abizad. He's the former head of US Central Command and military operations in Iraq. Listen to what he said, and I'm quoting. Of course, it's about oil. We can't really deny that. Next, we have Alan Greenspan, the former chairman of the US Federal Reserve. He wrote this in his memoir, and I'm quoting again. I'm saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows. The Iraq war is largely about oil. Then there's Chuck Hagel, a former US Defense Secretary. This is what he said. People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are. He said it in as many words. Iraqi lives are just collateral damage. And this story is not over. It's repeating itself in Ukraine. They're feeding another war and filling the coffers of US oil companies. Now to Pakistan. Guess what they're complaining about? Cross-border terrorism. Would have been funny had it not been so serious. Pakistan, of all countries, is fighting cross-border terrorism. And who are the terrorists? Pakistan's very own proteges, the Taliban. They were created and nurtured by the Pakistani state, and now they're showing that they have a mind of their own. Pakistan helped the Taliban come to power in 2021, and since then, they've been fighting. Taliban fighters have entered Pakistan. They've launched terror attacks. There has been friction at the border. And Islamabad is looking helpless, unable to rein in the beast they created. So now Pakistan's defense minister has issued a warning, and it seems he's taking inspiration from India. Khwaja Asif is threatening to conduct surgical strikes. Not making this up. Listen to this, and I'm quoting from what he said. This is Khwaja Asif, the defense minister of Pakistan. He says, if that is not done, at some point we'll have to resort to some measures which will definitely, wherever terrorists are, their sanctuaries on Afghan soil, we'll have to hit them. We'll have to hit them because we cannot tolerate the situation for long. I know it's hard to process. This country is a terror state, the headquarters of global terrorism, the pioneers of cross-border terrorism. If there's one thing they've done consistently since the formation of Pakistan, it is launching terror attacks against India. And now the same Pakistan is complaining about another neighbor. You know what they say? What goes around comes around. So Khwaja Asif, the defense minister of Pakistan, is warning the Taliban leadership. Apparently, they made some promises, but they failed to keep them. After all, they've learned from Pakistan, and evidently, they've learned well. Reports say they were asked for two things. Number one, stop supporting anti-Pak terrorists. And number two, stop terror attacks from Afghan soil. Irony died 1,000 deaths here. Pakistan is telling a terror group it created to stop terrorist attacks. Khwaja Asif's interview has some great material for stand-up comics. Although what's happening in Pakistan is no laughing matter, they don't pull the strings in Kabul anymore. And one of Kabul's closest allies is targeting them. Pakistan's biggest headache right now is a group called the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, also known as the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP. They are the ones fomenting trouble. In December last year, the TTP had 7,000 to 10,000 fighters in and around Pakistan's border with Afghanistan. This group is gaining influence in areas like Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, South Waziristan and North Waziristan. In November 2021, a ceasefire was secured, a ceasefire between Pakistan and the TTP, and reports say the Taliban in Kabul brokered the ceasefire. But last year, this deal collapsed. The TTP and its affiliates stepped up attacks. They began striking inside Pakistan. In 2022, they conducted at least 367 attacks. 367 attacks in a year, that's more than one attack a day. And they've been targeting Pakistani security forces. Going by one report, the TTP has taken the lives of hundreds of Pakistani cops and soldiers. Pakistan is facing a full-blown insurgency. The situation at the border is tense. And this is a landlocked border, the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It has 18 main crossing points, 18 checkpoints. Out of these, two are the biggest and the busiest, the Torkham and the Chaman border posts. These two are the busiest. And recently, both of them witnessed clashes. In December last year, at least 6 Pakistanis were killed in firing. And in February this year, there was a firing incident at the Torkham post. This was after a unilateral action from the Taliban. They suddenly decided to shut down the border crossing. Why did they do it? It was an act of retaliation. Apparently, Pakistan had blocked the entry of an Afghan patient's attendant. And the Taliban hit back at Islamabad. It says Pakistan is, quote-unquote, not honoring its commitments. So there is anger on both sides. The Taliban is upset with Pakistan. It doesn't like being told what to do. And Pakistan is coming to terms with the fact that the Taliban will behave like the Taliban with everyone. It wants something to be done about the terrorists, or it will explore military options, it says. And if history is anything to go by, this won't end well. Meanwhile, Pakistan's iron brother China is up to its old games. The Muslim holy month of Ramzan is on, and a new report on Chinese Muslims is out. These are the Uyghurs in China's Xinjiang province. They're among the most persecuted people in the world, and our reports say they're not being allowed to fast during Ramadan. Of course, Pakistan is not complaining or condemning this. Neither is any other Islamic nation. They only want to champion the cause of Indian Muslims. Ramadan or not, they will not question China. But we'll tell you what's going on. Quick primer first. Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group. Some of them reside in Central Asian countries, but most of them come from China's northwestern province of Xinjiang. It's home to over 10 million Uyghurs. They make up less than 1% of China's total population, but they're almost half of the population of the Xinjiang province. Over the last few years, these people have been under attack, constant attack by the Chinese state. More than 1 million of them have been jailed. There are reports of forced labor and state-sanctioned rape. Uyghurs live under severe restrictions and surveillance. And now they're not being allowed to pray during Ramadan, to fast during Ramadan. Reports say China has sent spies into Uyghur villages to enforce this. Beijing calls them years. And these spies or years are mostly Uyghurs. China uses them to oppress their own people. What do? These spies bring reports of fasting to the Chinese authorities, and those found observing the Ramadan fast are rounded up. It's a flagrant violation of human rights, and sadly, it's not new. No one seems to be doing very much about it. Once in a while, Western agencies and leaders bring it up. As we speak, the German foreign minister is in Beijing. This is what she said earlier today.
Since respect for human rights is also in our economic interest, I explained to my colleague in our bilateral talks that we are concerned that the scope for civil society engagement in China is shrinking. Human rights are being curtailed. What this means for Uyghurs is documented in black and white in the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
The UN Human Rights Commission released a report last year. It talked about mass arbitrary detentions, torture, cultural persecution, family separations, forced labor and sexual violence. And this has been going on for years. Beijing has been going after Uyghurs since at least 2017. That's when China began rounding up Uyghurs and putting them into concentration camps. China calls them re-education and training camps. It says people were sent there to these camps to prevent radicalization. But those who survive and escape have horror stories to tell. Here's one such.
On 1st of April 2017, all women detainees were chained onto the bed. I was chained to the bed for 20 days. The first they shackled my feet and then they detained. The women's condition in the detention centers are horrible. All women are shackled and our language of Uyghur will prohibit to speak.
Does that sound like re-education and training to you? A former Human Rights Watch chief described the situation like this.
So, for example, even today in the Xinjiang region of China, where the Chinese government is detaining, 1 million Uyghur Muslims to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, and their language. That's, one of the biggest crimes against humanity being committed today.
Forced to abandon their religion, culture, and language, he says. The camp survivor earlier said she was not allowed to speak her language. And now reports say they're not being allowed to fast during Ramadan. If this isn't cultural genocide, I don't know what is. The Chinese are killing the Uyghur identity. The dominant ethnic group in China is called the Han Chinese. The Uyghurs are being forced to assimilate, to adopt the dominant Han Chinese way of life. Beijing, of course, denies all of this. And this is not the first time Uyghurs are being barred from fasting during Ramadan. Similar reports have come out in the past. They came out 2 years ago. Those under 65 years of age were not allowed to fast then. This time, apparently, there's a blanket ban. But who will question China? World leaders are busy propping it up as a peacemaker. There are leaders who wax eloquent about human rights. But when it comes to the Chinese state, they pretend that none of it is happening. Brazil's President Lula da Silva is visiting China, and usually diplomatic visits are a boring affair. They stick to a usual pattern: the bilateral meetings, the signing of agreements, photo ops, and leaders waving at cameras. But President Lula is breaking away from tradition. Last evening, he took everyone by surprise. He launched a very public war against the US dollar. Lula made some scathing remarks. Listen to this. And I'm quoting, "Why should every country have to be tied to the dollar for trade? Who decided the dollar would be the world's currency? Why can't a bank like the Brics Bank have a currency to finance trade between Brazil and China, between Brazil and other Brics countries? Today, countries have to chase after dollars to export when they could be exporting in their own currencies." And Lula da Silva did not stop there. He trained his guns on Western financing institutions next, specifically at the International Monetary Fund or the IMF. This is what he said: "No bank should be asphyxiating countries as economies the way the IMF is doing now with Argentina, or the way they did with Brazil for a long time and every third world country. No leader can work with a knife to their throat because their country owes money." These are some very strong words, and Lula chose the perfect stage to say all of this. He picked the perfect occasion to launch his war against the US dollar. He delivered his impassioned speech at the New Development Bank, better known as the Brics Bank. Brics is a grouping. It stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, BRICS. These are the world's largest economies, largest emerging economies. Their group is called Brics. They've set up a bank called the New Development Bank. It was established in 2015. It's a multilateral development bank, and it provides financing for infrastructure and development projects. The bank has members beyond Brics nations. They include countries like Egypt, Bangladesh, Uruguay, and the UAE. A former Brazilian president is now in charge of this bank. Her name is Dilma Rousseff. She's the bank's new chief executive. Yesterday was the inauguration ceremony, and that's why Lula was there. Under him, Brazil is taking a very aggressive stand against the US dollar. Lula believes the Brics can offer a better alternative. So with a Brazilian at the helm of a major Brics institution and the world order in a state of flux, President Lula is making a push for a Brics currency. Like we've told you earlier, this idea has been around for a while. It's not new. Russia, too, has been asking the Brics to consider this proposal. And now Lula is pushing this idea, and that too quite strongly and quite publicly. The question is, will the other members go for it? Because don't forget the China factor. Lula has been leaning towards China. Before launching a public tirade against the US dollar, Brazil and China reached an agreement of their own, a deal to trade in their local currencies and to not use the US dollar to conduct bilateral trade. So China uses the yuan and Brazil the real. This deal was sealed before Lula flew down to Beijing. And bilateral agreements like these are far easier to secure, but the idea of a larger Brics currency is going to be a tough sell. For starters, will India support the idea? Will India work with China on a common currency? We ask this because this would encourage interdependency, and India at this point is hoping to achieve the opposite, to cut its dependence on China. So the plan for a Brics currency may not take off just yet. But that doesn't mean that Lula is not on the right track. His statement against the dollar only echoes the larger sentiment. The dominance of the greenback is under threat, and the challengers are rising. To America now, but before I talk about my next story, let's list some of the internal problems of the US. Gun violence, police brutality, rampant racism, economic turmoil, homelessness. I could go on. But you know what America has chosen to declare war on? It's women, particularly their bodies and their agency over it. First, the facts. The state of Florida has voted to prohibit abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. It will be one of the most restrictive abortion laws, not just in the US, but in the world. Here's an example of how drastic it is. At 6 weeks, most women don't even realize that they're pregnant. Florida's existing law allows abortions up to 15 weeks of pregnancy. Just a year ago, it allowed abortions until 24 weeks of pregnancy. And what's the standard practice worldwide? Many countries allow abortion till 12 weeks on request and up to 24 weeks in cases of rape, incest, fetal impairment, and risk to the mother's life. In India, the limit is 24 weeks. Last year, in a landmark ruling, the Indian Supreme Court said that all women are entitled to a safe and legal abortion irrespective of their marital status. Now juxtapose this with what the US Supreme Court did in 2022. It overturned the landmark Roe versus Wade legislation. What is this law? It guaranteed access to abortion as a federal right in the US. It guaranteed the right to abortion to US women. The court struck it down. And with that one decision, the legal protection that women had in the US for 50 years was gone. So now each state can decide what they want. They can curb or ban abortion rights, and they're doing it. Cue Florida. This is what a Republican lawmaker in Florida said, and I'm quoting. For the past 50 years, we've had a culture grow in this nation, a culture of abortion for any reason at any time. Today, we stand for life. Now listen to what Florida's governor, Ron DeSantis, said. He's a Republican presidential contender, and he said this a few days back.
This leftist agenda, the woke ideology, is a threat to our freedoms. Our bottom line is we do not surrender to the woke mob. Florida's where woke goes to die.
He's echoing what many Republicans believe, that woke is morally broke. This broadside is neither casual nor impromptu. It's an election soapbox to cater to their constituents, because the issue of abortion in America is a deeply political and divisive one. Now, just to clarify, we are no flag bearers of wokeism. Neither are we debating the political merits of Republicans or Democrats. We are asking some very fundamental questions here. Like, why is the US denying its women access to safe and legal abortion? the freedom to choose what to do with their own bodies. And Florida is not an isolated case. Last Friday, a judge in Texas revoked an FDA approval. FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. It's a regulatory authority for food and medicines in America. A Texas judge revoked its approval of a drug called mifepristone. And why is this significant? Because mifepristone is one of the 2 drugs used for medically induced abortions. Simply put, it's an abortion pill. So banning it would have far-reaching implications. But the US president and his deputy condemned the ruling.
My thoughts are it's completely out of bounds what the judge did. Thank you.
And for once, the Biden administration acted swiftly as well. They appealed to a higher court. The Texas judge's decision has been put on hold. So for now, the abortion pill remains available in the US, but with strict limitations. It's a small victory, but the big picture remains bleak for women in America. And at the heart of the debate are serious questions. Questions like, who decides for women? Do they or do lawmakers? Is procreation a personal choice or a political tool? Women having agency over their bodies, is it a fundamental right or a subversive thought? Do you know the gender of those making these critical decisions on behalf of women? Men, mostly white, middle-aged men. Most of the lawmakers who decided in Florida on the 6-week abortion ban were men. The Texas judge who banned the abortion pill, a 46-year-old white man. The tale of gendered oppression is as old as time. Former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made an impassioned speech in 1995 at a UN conference on women.
It is a violation of human rights when women are denied the right to plan their own families, and that includes being forced to have abortions or being sterilized against their will. If there is one message that echoes forth from this conference, let it be that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
It's 2023, but women in the so-called land of the free are still not free to make choices about their own bodies and, by extension, their lives. And the tragic irony is this: the US is more concerned about the unborn fetus than it is about the safety of its children. Because gatekeeping the gunmen running riot at American schools is a far tougher task than weaponizing women's bodies for political leverage. So when it comes to women, we say America is no better than the Taliban. Classified US documents leaked this week. We told you about it in detail. They laid bare many military secrets, and they upset many allies of Washington. The question was, who did it? And now the Americans have an answer, and frankly, it's quite embarrassing for them. The suspect behind this leak is all of 21 years old. What's worse, he's a junior employee of the US Defense Department. All that his job role requires is a high school degree, a driver's license, and up to 18 months of training on the job. That's all. It doesn't sound like the credentials of a mastermind, does it? And this man pulled off America's biggest defense leak of the decade. Washington is going to have a hard time explaining how this happened. Here's a report.
The FBI has arrested Jack Teixeira, a 21-year-old Air National Guardsman. Federal agents came in an armored car, swooped in on him at his home in Massachusetts. The neighbors were shocked.
I think it's nuts. Nothing like this has ever happened around here. Like, this is a very small community. Everybody knows each other.
Teixeira is suspected of leaking America's classified defense documents. He could face charges under the Espionage Act, and each charge can carry up to a 10-year prison term, with each leaked document treated as a separate count in his indictment. In other words, he could be facing a very long jail sentence. But let's put this in perspective. This was the biggest US intelligence leak in a decade, and it was committed by a junior Pentagon officer. As far as the hierarchy goes, he's being called an insignificant National Guard. He shared these documents and pictures on an online chat room among friends and acquaintances, some of whom are teenagers. And this leak discloses important classified information. There are in-depth assessments of the Ukraine war and information on how the US collects its intelligence. Later, he also told his friends to delete this information and lay low. This is embarrassing for Washington, to say the least, and raises the obvious question: how safe is America's sensitive information? Can the so-called most powerful nation of the world keep a secret? For now, this is what US President Joe Biden has said.
There is a full-blown investigation going on, as you know, with the intelligence community and the Justice Department, and they're getting close.
But he has also downplayed the matter.
I'm not concerned about the leakages, and I'm concerned that it happened. But there's nothing contemporaneous that I'm aware of that is of great consequence.
As of 2019, about 3 million people had the permission to access America's classified documents. Sounds like oversharing, right? It has become protocol after the 9/11 attacks. They believe information must be spread relatively widely to avoid a similar attack in the future. But experts think this creates problems because the US loses some control. It can't keep track of who spreads what information and when. It's understandable that national security officials need to do their jobs. They need access to databases and raw information. But let's remember an important tenet in the intelligence community. Information should only be accessed by people who need to know. Need is the key word here, and it goes against laying a nation's secrets wide open, even if it's among those with security clearances. Maybe Washington is learning its lesson the hard way, because the Pentagon is under fire and tightening its circle of employees and contractors, awaiting a review of its access and procedures. The US is hoping it works because its vulnerabilities are now for the world to see.
And now to Sri Lanka. It is facing its worst economic crisis, and a lot of it has to do with China, Chinese loans to be precise. But Sri Lanka is back to doing business with the Chinese. They're going to sell monkeys to China. 100,000 monkeys, because China requested for these monkeys. But why does China need them from Sri Lanka? And why is Sri Lanka selling them so willingly to the Chinese? Our next report has the answers. Recently, China approached Sri Lanka with a strange request. China said it needs monkeys, tens of thousands of them, supposedly to keep them in more than 1,000 zoos across China. And now, cash-strapped Sri Lanka is considering this request. Soon 100,000 Sri Lankan monkeys could be shipped off to China, and this would need some tweaking of laws, because Sri Lanka bans the export of all live animals. So why are they making an exception for China? To make money, perhaps. How much money? That they won't tell. The financial details of this deal are not being disclosed. But it's not just about the money. Of course, it's a big incentive given Sri Lanka's economic crisis. Every penny counts. But Colombo also wants to be in the good books of China. You could call it Stockholm Syndrome. Financial transactions with China spelled the ruin of Sri Lanka. And here they are again, selling monkeys. Experts give yet another reason, though. They say monkeys have become a menace in Sri Lanka. In fact, they're classified as pests. Sri Lanka has a population of 3 million monkeys, and they're running riot. They frequently destroy crops and make the lives of farmers incredibly difficult. Sri Lanka's monkey situation is so serious that people are now allowed to kill them in broad daylight. The country's agriculture minister, Mahinda Amaravira, gave farmers a free hand in February. He told farmers that there's no other option but to kill monkeys to control their population. Sri Lanka is famous for the toque macaque monkeys. They're endemic to Sri Lanka, meaning they're found only in Sri Lanka. But if China has its way, soon they'll also be found jumping around in Chinese zoos. Earlier this year, Colombo took away their immunity. It has removed monkeys from its protected list of species. Elsewhere, they're classified as endangered animals. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, has put these Lankan monkeys on its red list of endangered animals. But China says it needs them for zoos, and 100,000 of them. Here's another theory that's doing the rounds. It questions where the Lankan monkeys may end up in China, in their zoos or on their plates. Monkey meat is traditionally viewed as a prized delicacy in Chinese cuisine. It is believed to have medicinal qualities. Monkey brains are a dish only the very rich Chinese can afford. While most Chinese people view the consumption of monkey meat as abhorring, there is enough literature to suggest that monkey meat has been consumed in China for ages. So the odds for Sri Lanka's monkeys are not very good. Either they're sent to China, facing an uncertain future, or they're killed in Sri Lanka by a government that views them as pests. Now let's shift our focus to Africa, just like India seems to be doing. India's External Affairs Minister S. Shankar is on a 6-day visit to the continent. He began with a 3-day trip to Uganda and now he's in Mozambique. Mozambique is a country of about 31 million people. It's located in southeastern Africa. Shankar is there to foster ties. When he arrived yesterday, he was given what he calls an energetic welcome. Then he took a train ride. What's so special about this? It's a made-in-India train. This was with Mozambique's Transport Minister, Mateus Magala. They even conducted a press conference on the moving train. Shankar called it a novel experience. He then interacted with the Indian diaspora in the country. He spoke about historic ties between the two nations. These ties go back centuries, and they've been given a boost of late. On the economic front, there's, of course, the Made in India train that Shankar was on. He also virtually inaugurated a bridge in Mozambique. It's called the Buzi Bridge. It's more than 700 meters long. It was funded by an Indian line of credit. But India's Africa outreach is not just limited to development projects. There are other avenues of cooperation like defense. Last month, India hosted the first ever India-Africa Army Chiefs Conclave. 31 African nations sent their chiefs or representatives. It was a bid to both improve ties and talk about arms exports. You see, most African nations import arms and ammunition, and India is trying to become a global defense exporter. So it makes sense for India to explore this market. And this market is opening up. Presently, Africa primarily imports weapons from Russia. Russian arms made up about 40% of Africa's defense imports between 2018 and 2022. But of course, Russia is currently busy with its own war, the war in Ukraine. It may not be able to spare arms for export. So India could try and fill that gap. India reportedly exports only about 10 to 15% of its arms to Africa at the moment. New Delhi could try and increase its slice of the pie. And it may be something that appeals to African nations as well, considering the shared history. Take a look at this. Images from this morning, Shankar paying homage to Mozambique's freedom struggle. India and almost all African nations share a history of colonial oppression. While India shook off the British yoke in 1947, Mozambique gained independence from Portugal only in 1975. European nations exploited Africa for centuries. It was called the Scramble for Africa, and it left the continent impoverished. The effects of that scramble continue to scar Africa and to shape its present partnerships. Most former colonizers have a disproportionate presence in Africa, and it does lead to tensions. Look at what happened in Burkina Faso recently. Locals protested the French military presence in the country. France finally had to withdraw its troops in February, but not without giving a parting shot. Paris was critical of Moscow's influence in Africa. It said Russia was trying to make inroads into the continent, trying to expand its military influence. It sounds a bit too much like colonial times for comfort. Europeans bickering over who controls what in Africa. But India could offer something different. A partnership based on mutual respect. A coming together of the so-called global south, instead of nations once again becoming pawns in the great power games. That is what India is working towards, and Shankar's trip is another step in that direction. Have you heard about an artificial sun? Like a human-made sun that can generate power. China has made it. It's quite a feat. China's artificial sun has broken a world record. It's been able to produce power by fusion for a full 7 minutes. Fusion is the joining of two atoms. When they combine, they produce a lot of energy. And this is the energy that powers the sun and stars. Now it's being created in a Chinese lab, and they're not the only ones working on it. Fusion power can change the world. It may sound like science fiction, but it's being developed as we speak. Our next report tells you more.
It seems the world is revolving around artificial suns. From scientists to movie enthusiasts, people can't stop talking about them. Do you remember Dr. Octopus from Spider-Man? He created an artificial sun, but when it got out of control, so did he. Hopefully, real-life artificial suns won't be creating any supervillains. In fact, they might be the hero we've been waiting for. So what is an artificial sun? It's a huge machine which is capable of creating huge amounts of power. It takes hot plasma, which is a blazing combination of gases, and further heats it up to above 100 million degrees Celsius. To give you a rough idea, that's 10 times hotter than the core of the sun. This kind of heat is held in for as long as possible. That's when loads of energy is released. Hopefully, one day scientists will be able to harness it, and we'll get to why that's important. But first, let's talk about a new feat in this technology. China has broken a record. More specifically, the Experimental Advanced Superconducting Tokamak, or EAST, has. It was able to confine the superhot plasma and keep its power high and stable for a whopping 403 seconds. That's about 7 minutes. It's quite the task, about 4 times the previous record of 101 seconds. This record was also held by China. It was set in 2017. So now, not only have previous records been shattered, the world has gotten close to making fusion reactors even better. They use the same science as what happens on the sun, and it can give immense amounts of energy.
Fusion is taking two small atoms and putting them together. And in terms of the practicality of building a power plant, fusion has a number of advantages. It's much more inherently safe.
Fusion power is safe and clean. It doesn't produce radioactive byproducts. It doesn't even have harmful carbon emissions. It's also a near limitless energy source, so it can help us move away from fossil fuels. The materials used to make it are in abundance on Earth.
So fusion is one of those technologies which, if it could be harnessed, could be scaled up rapidly, to be deployed worldwide by 2050. And could make a very big difference to climate, to carbon emissions and therefore to climate change from 2050 onwards.
So this is clearly an exciting time for green energy. That's why many artificial suns are being tinkered with.
I think this is a very exciting time. People have been working on fusion for many decades. There's many milestones that are being reported in the last few years.
Last year, South Korea created an artificial sun. The world is also building its biggest artificial sun in France, with inputs from India, China, US, Europe, Japan, Russia, and South Korea. It's reportedly the most expensive science project of all time. The world is collectively working towards fusion energy. This welcomes huge possibilities. And fusion experts say it won't be long before the world gets its unlimited source of energy.
And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. We're starting with North Korea. They tested a new solid fuel intercontinental ballistic missile. It's called the Hwasong-18. The test aims to radically promote North Korea's nuclear counterattack capability. In France, protests against President Macron's pension reforms continue. Fresh clashes erupted between police and protesters in Paris. Meanwhile, a bridge collapsed in the western part of Colombia. 2 police officials have lost their lives. In Afghanistan, lack of infrastructure is making it difficult for teachers to reach schools. And finally, what happened today in history? The Soviet Union agreed to withdraw from Afghanistan. The year was 1988. It had been 9 years since the USSR entered Afghanistan. Their aim was to establish a pro-Soviet regime in Kabul, but they faced resistance. It led to heavy Russian casualties. Eventually, the cost of the conflict shot up so much that the Soviet Union decided it would pull out its forces from Afghanistan. In exchange, the United States agreed to stop sending arms to Afghanistan. Around 1 million civilians were killed in this conflict. Leaving you with this. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.
Uy, Dios mío. Bendito sea el Señor. Señor bendito.
Ahora sigo.
советских людей, всей мировой общественности.
The BJP is also saying that if there is no relief from the court of law, then there must have been something wrong. Then that also holds good for Veer Savarkar and Bhagat Singh in India, because they were also hoisted with cases of breaking this nation by the British. So let's not get into that. The courts will do its. The courts are supposed to dispense justice according to law, and they will do it in the due course. The question here is very simple, that if Mr. Arvind Kejriwal is being summoned by the CBI on the prima facie case that some bureaucrat deemed him, then isn't it also true that Mr. Adani follows the Prime Minister of India on his foreign jaunts? Then the Prime Minister is also liable to be investigated by a JPC. How can you have one law for the Chief Minister of a nation and another law for the Prime Minister of a nation? Just like Aam Aadmi Party is saying that Arvind Kejriwal has done nothing wrong, and the courts will say it, and you are saying that the BJP is saying that if Arvind Kejriwal has done nothing wrong, let the court say it. The same holds good for the Prime Minister also, because Adani and the Prime Minister's hobnobbing.
Mr. Sirsa, I'll come to you. Mr. Sirsa, I'll come to you. Yeah.
Adani and the Prime Minister hobnobbing together is public knowledge. And after the Hindenburg report and lakhs and crores of rupees of Adani going down the drain, isn't it also appropriate?
Siddharji, allow me an interjection. Siddharji, allow me an interjection. While the opposition, as a leader of the opposition opposed to the BJP at the central level, at the union level, Aam Aadmi Party, Congress or any other political party has the right to ask BJP any question they deem fit in the larger public interest. You have done it on the floor of the House. You have done it in the public domain. Very good. Right now, I'm asking you some very specific questions because this pertains to the liquor policy scam. The argument that the BJP is making is that the Aam Aadmi Party has just one defense. Look, this is political witch hunt. Look, this is vendetta. If all of this is true, then why aren't you able to secure even bail from the courts of law? Mr. Satyendra Jain, Manish Sisodia, all of them have been booked and none of them have been able to secure any kind of bail or relief from the special courts.
At the cost of repetition, Anusha, I will say that Bhagat Singh and Veer Savarkar also did not.
Okay, without going into the political. Siddharji, one second. Siddharji, one second, because you repeated your argument. Siddharji, without getting into the political grandeur of the status of Bhagat Singh or any other great leader of this country, those were examples of a pre-independent India when the British was ruling this country. Are you comparing that law and order and that constitutional scheme with a modern, independent, democratic India, sir? Is that the comparison you're drawing?
You just drew it perfect analogy. That is exactly what is happening. The law is being abused just like the Britishers abused law. There is a law and there is an abuse of law. There is a matchbox can be used to cook somebody's food, and the same matchbox can be used to burn somebody's house.
Substantiate
BJP
that,
is
sir.
using it, and that is open for
Substantiate that,
everyone
sir.
to see.
Substantiate that. That's what I want to know.
I'm
If the BJP
substantiating
is
that
doing
by
it,
saying
if the
that if
BJP
the
is
law
doing it, substantiate that.
I'm substantiating it by saying, Anusha, that if the law is same for everyone, why doesn't the Prime Minister also agree to a JPC and get a similar kind of clean check from JPC? You don't want to get into JPC.
Okay.
After lakhs and crores of rupees going down the drain of the exchequer, and you are harassing opponents right from Telangana to Tamil Nadu to Delhi. This is
Siddharthji,
exactly
at the risk of repetition, you have not answered my.
Hello and welcome to the late night edition with me, Ayushman Singh Jamba. Top breaking news coming in after summons were issued against Delhi Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal in the Delhi liquor raids case. Aam Aadmi Party is seeking legal opinion from senior advocate Abhishek Manu Singhvi to decide the future course of action. That's what top sources are telling CNN News 18. Sources say, as of now, no decision has been taken to challenge the summons issued by the central agency. That's the piece of breaking news that's coming in amid the Liquorgate dangle. What we are learning from top sources is that the Aam Aadmi Party, namely Arvind Kejriwal, have reached out to Abhishek Manu Singhvi to seek his legal opinion. But sources say, as of now, no decision has been taken to challenge the summons by the central agency. I'm joined by my colleague Ananya Bhatnagar, who's getting us this piece of breaking news. Ananya, give us the details.
Our sources have told us that Mr. Kejriwal and the legal team of the Aam Aadmi Party is in direct consultation with, in fact, senior advocate Abhishek Manu Singhvi. Remember that Singhvi is somebody who is generally consulted by the Aam Aadmi Party, and he's also on the panel of the political party when it comes to, and in fact, not only the political party, but also the Delhi government when it comes to important cases. We've seen how he has appeared for Manish Sisodia, how he's appeared for, in fact, he has made certain kind of mentionings for Delhi government in the Supreme Court as well. So definitely, he's somebody who's a very, very key player when it comes to, the legal strategies of the Aam Aadmi Party. And since now Arvind Kejriwal has been summoned, the legal opinion is being sought from Mr. Singhvi as to how he should approach these summons and whether or not he should go. But as of now, there is no kind of a decision that has been taken on whether these summons that have been issued by the central agency should be challenged or not, and whether, Mr. Kejriwal would be making any kind of a legal move ahead of his appearance before the Central Bureau of Investigation. Because remember that these summons, as we have been told, is under 160 of the CRPC and are only as a witness in this case, and there is no likelihood that Mr. Kejriwal would be arrested, at least on the April 16th when he will be appearing before the agency. However, the questioning can continue.